So now I'd like to introduce Brad Brooks-Rubin, wherever you are. There you are. Brad is a senior advisor in the Office of Sanctions at the U.S. State Department, and he's going to be talking with us this morning about the impact of sanctions and the business that we're all in. So we better understand these rather complicated.
Okay, working?
Did you need it?
I did. Can you all hear me? All right. It's humbling to start anything after reference to Dewa. I had chances to work closely with Dewa starting in 2009 with his brave revelations around what was happening in Merengue. He was someone I trusted and relied on for many, many years, and his loss is one I, and I know many in our community still feel. So thank you for remembering him, and I will try to do justice to his honor in these remarks. So thanks so much to Susan and the whole team at the Chicago Responsible Jewelry Conference. I had the privilege to join a panel virtually in 2020, but I actually never attended in person. And it's an honor to be invited and a joy to be with so many old and new friends. The topic of this keynote speech is sanctions and the jewelry sector. I'll comment up front that my younger son is taking public speaking in high school and suggest that I follow his lead and give a speech on what is the best breakfast food. But I suppose it's not why Susan asked me to come. Crepes, by the way. So breakfast aside, I'm also not sure sanctions is the topic most would choose to kick off a motivational and inspiring weekend like the one in store, given all the amazing speakers here to talk about remarkable, innovative, challenging, and transformative work going on around the world. Sanctions is usually a buzzkill. But in different ways, I'm going to try to make this topic exactly that, motivational and hopefully a bit inspiring. I have been focused on these issues for nearly 16 years, working as a lawyer for Treasury's Sanctions Office, called OFAC, then at the State Department on conflict diamonds and conflict minerals in Eastern Congo, work that also involved sanctions, then at GIA, then at an NGO called The Century, then at the Responsible Jewelry Council, and now back at State. I've wrestled with the many risks in and affecting the sector from within the industry as well as with civil society and now government again. I have been my own multi-stakeholder initiative on these issues. And as you all know well, and we'll hear about over these next 2 days, there are a lot of risks. Normally a speech like this about sanctions is primarily focused on the details of those risks, from a perspective of conveying very serious news and the specter of what will happen should you run afoul of those risks. In some cases, the audience may include many folks who are ready to run those risks and see what happens, or who are just entirely unaware. If we are friends on Facebook or you've heard me speak before, you know I am obsessed with music, and especially with hip-hop from Chicago. And although my real love is for the amazing group of newer artists here at the moment, I'll start this speech by giving props to one of Chicago's legends, Lupe Fiasco, who said whether he should care about conflict diamonds on what is, I would argue, the single best song ever produced about these issues in the industry, quote, and I wasn't thinking twice when I was putting mine on, about you, I won't give her laugh. Sorry. I have not had nearly enough coffee. Quote, and I wasn't thinking twice when I was putting mine on, about a young shorty in Sierra Leone, or the other conflict countries that people call home. I figured I would never go to Angola, so it never did affect me, maybe indirectly. That my necklace was funding a rebellion or a military coup, fueled by militias who don't follow any of Geneva's rules. But you are not the audience that is unaware of the risks or willing to look past them. You are the audience that does go to conflict countries and does think about the people and the consequences of what these resources can do, both in terms of the beauty they unleash, but also the challenges they come with. You know these issues do affect us, and very directly. So although I may surprise you in a minute with one or two sanctions actions you have not heard about, my guess is most of this bad news is also old news to this group. Partially because through ethical metalsmiths, JVC, and other organizations and news sources, you keep yourselves well informed. But also because most of you are out there doing the hard work of looking for sources, for partners, for context directly on the ground that can become your brands, piece by piece. or because you are the partner organizations, the community groups, the consultants trying to bring about that change along with the jewelers. So you may know the risks as well as, or even better than we in the US government do. And that, to me, is where the motivation and inspiration, the good news, can come in. But, like any good speech that has good news, you gotta start with the bad news. So let's walk through the bad news. What are those sanctions risks? Where do they exist, and what do they mean? My admittedly very long list is just US sanctions. In many cases, other governments such as the EU, UK, Canada, or the UN Security Council may also have the same or at least similar sanctions in place. So, fasten your seatbelts, here we go. Diamonds. There is an import ban on Russian origin rough and polished in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This is, of course, the principal focus for the US government and our partners at the moment, and we are searching for continued ways to put pressure on Russia's ability to carry out its war. There is also a designation in full blocking of Alrosa, meaning that you cannot do business with Alrosa or with any product in which Alrosa has an interest. There is also a designation against the CEO of Alrosa. You're going to hear me use the term designation and full blocking a lot over the next few minutes, and this is what it means. The target's assets are frozen, so if any US person or bank is holding those assets, they need to freeze them and put them in an interest-bearing account, and no US person can engage in any transaction in which that target has an interest. In most cases, any individual I name will also be subject to a visa ban blocking their entry into the United States. Okay, that's Russia. There's designation and full blocking of companies in the Central African Republic linked actually to Russia, to the Wagner Group and the network of Yevgeny Prigozhin, a group of mercenaries who I'll come back and talk to a bit more about in a minute. There are also several armed group leaders in the Central African Republic sanctioned for their commission of atrocities as well as their role in the diamond and gold sectors there, including Abdoulaye Sen, Ali Darassa, and several others. Designation and full blocking of companies in Zimbabwe, including the parastatal companies responsible for diamond investments and exports, and other companies active in the sector, including gold. This also includes designation of Chinese businessman Sam Pa, who facilitated a range of corrupt deals in the sector. In Zimbabwe, there are also sanctions against a businessman named Kudkashwe Tagwire, and many of his companies and business partners for their role in corrupt business deals across many sectors, including mining. Designation and full blocking of a company called International Diamond Industries in the DRC, a company linked to Israeli mining magnate Dan Gertler, who is responsible for billions of dollars of corrupt deals in the country and designated under our global Magnitsky sanctions program as a result. Gertler is actually mainly known now for his role in cobalt, copper, oil, iron, manganese, and other resources outside of diamonds. One of his diamond companies is blocked, and Diamond World is where Dan Gertler got his start. A quick note on Global Magnitsky, or GLOMAG as you often hear it called. You actually hear a lot about it these days in the sanctions and in the advocacy world. It's a sanctions program that can allow for this designation of any individual or entity responsible for corruption or serious human rights abuse anywhere in the world. A number of other jurisdictions have followed the US in setting up GLOMAG programs. It includes designation, blocking of assets, as well as visa bans. And there are a lot of advocacy groups that focus on looking for targets for GLOMAG designations that relate to the jewelry sector. Okay, that's diamonds. Gold. Russia, similar to diamonds, there is an import ban on gold for Russia. Venezuela, there is a designation and full blocking of the state mining company and its president. There is also an executive order, which is what the president issues, that sets out what a sanctions program is, that provides the authority to designate, to sanction any individual or entity operating in the gold sector in Venezuela. Nicaragua. We have designated and sanctioned the state mining company, as well as recently the Directorate General of Mines. There is also a recent executive order that matches what I discussed about the Venezuela program and provides the authority to sanction any individual or entity operating in the gold sector in Nicaragua. the Wagner Group. So there are gold companies in Sudan, the Central African Republic, and Burkina Faso that have been sanctioned for their connection to the Wagner Group, which is, I'm sure many of you have heard about it, it's a network of basically mercenaries operating across sub-Saharan Africa, serving as Praetorian guards basically for various regimes. They've now become very active in the war in Ukraine, committed atrocities. They also are many of the people behind disinformation campaigns, election interference, you name it. And the US government has issued a series of sanctions actions against that network and continues to look for more. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the countries I mentioned, often they are getting paid not in cash, but in concessions and in natural resources. The DRC, Uganda, UAE. Earlier this year, there was designation and full blocking of a network of gold traders and refiners active across eastern Congo, Uganda, sending that gold to the UAE and Belgium, connected to conflict and illicit gold in eastern Congo. This is the Alan Getz network. And it is a network that was sanctioned, and also there are others similar to it that have not yet been sanctioned. Girdler, as I mentioned above, although gold and diamonds are not really the focus of his network, there are gold companies in Belgium designated for being under control by his main business proxy. There are also gold refineries, jewelers, and dealers in Turkey and South Africa connected to terrorism that have also been sanctioned. Colored stones. Burma. Although imports are no longer prohibited like they were in the days of the Jade Act, the parastatal entities involved in the gem trade in Burma have been designated. In Afghanistan, transactions are permitted with Afghanistan if the Taliban or Al-Qaeda network do not have an interest, including paying customs fees to the Taliban government, but due diligence is still critical to ensure that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda network don't have an interest in gemstone transactions themselves. All right, deep breath. That's a lot. Quick note about money laundering. Money laundering is not sanctions. In very basic sum, sanctions are a political foreign policy tool that targets actors, jurisdictions, transaction types of the kind that I just listed to achieve a policy goal in the hope of changing behavior or denying access to the US financial system that could allow bad actions to continue. Money laundering is criminal behavior in which the proceeds of one of a specific list of enumerated crimes, often called predicate offenses, are moved through the financial system in a manner designed to conceal where the funds come from. But given the fact that precious stones and precious metals can be a means of conveying value, dealers in these goods are covered by AML, anti-money laundering regulations, and for good reason. The Financial Action Task Force regional bodies covering West Africa as well as East and Southern Africa, Interpol, UN, OECD, and a range of other international institutions have issued report after report after report on the connection of gold and diamonds and colored stones to crime and money laundering, including detailed typologies of how these transactions can occur. I know Sarah Yu of JVC could not be here. Feel better, Sarah. But it's why you should listen to every word that she and JVC say. Not just because they provide great updates and alerts, but because it's important to recognize that a part of having an anti-money laundering compliance system is sanctions due diligence. You are obligated as U.S. persons to conduct sanctions due diligence and ensure you are not violating them no matter what, because there are very stiff financial penalties that can be incurred. But the point is that if you have an overarching approach to anti-money laundering compliance and due diligence, all the sanctions risks I just cataloged will be issues that you are covering in the normal course of your work. And you will neither be surprised when a new sanctions action is announced, nor will you need to recreate the wheel each time. Okay, so where's that good news and motivation that I talked about? Well, it comes precisely in how you all work. That is, there are perceptions out there that the industry is not doing enough, not taking these issues seriously, not pushing the boundaries to make change. My goal here today isn't to comment on those claims, on what's happening in the broader industry, so much as to acknowledge the good and hard work that you all are doing. Many of you are pushing the boundaries of due diligence, of supply chain integrity, of traceability. You are doing the hard, time-consuming, expensive, but ultimately essential work of ensuring that you don't just have a general sense of who your customers and suppliers probably are, feeling fine about rolling with comments like, I think Or, that's what the guy told me. Or, I've been dealing with these guys for decades, they would never lie to me. Or, you can't really know where goods come from. Most of you actually know. And that's where sanctions comes in. For most of the risks you are focused on, human rights, labor rights, corruption, mercury, climate change, deforestation, and on and on and on. The information, the identities, the concerns, they're big and they're pretty generalized. They can exist almost anywhere, at any point in time, in your transactions and in the journey of your pieces. There can also be a level of hedging or evaluation in how you consider these risks. That is it worthwhile to engage in a situation where there might be human rights or mercury usage risks for the sake of trying to work toward improvement over time? Possibly. Those can be challenging and, again, expensive decisions and subsequent processes to implement, as many of the sessions of this conference will detail. Sanctions, however, sanctions provide you with a level of specificity, with a clear and direct sense of which actors are a concern and cannot be dealt with. It's just a start, but it provides the question I have heard from companies to government over the last 15 years. Tell us what you want us to do. Sanctions are not the end of the answer to that question, but they are the absolute beginning, and they provide you with a clear direction to demonstrate the benefits of your work and how you do it, especially as the muscles that you all develop in working through the myriad other risks that you really focus on are very similar to the muscles you need for sanctions compliance and due diligence. And in the end, that is what the US government asks for. Establish a compliance program, ask questions, listen to the answers, implement meaningful due diligence, and make changes that you need to. As some of you will have seen, my boss, Ambassador James O'Brien, the State Department Sanctions Coordinator, convened large actors in the diamond industry a couple of weeks ago to deliver just that message, and it is ultimately the main one that I had for you. Implement due diligence, ask questions, listen to the answers, make changes. But is that it? What else can you do besides due diligence and ensuring you are not running afoul of sanctions risks? So here are a few thoughts. Support organizations and efforts dedicated to responsible sourcing, like this conference, like Ethical Metalsmiths, and many others. Keep educating yourselves through JVC and other programs like it, other organizations like it, even when it feels like the middle of my speech was a whole lot of bad news. Keep publishing resource guides, glossaries, and other tools that you and your industry can use. Continue to advocate and implement direct sourcing and traceability systems that enable you to know your product and everyone involved in its production along the way. Continue to be a part of development programs that make clear where the money is going and who is benefiting, and that it is the people on the ground and in the communities who need it the most. Engage your suppliers and business partners, including your banks, on these issues and tell them what you and ask them what they are doing to address them. This may not sound obvious, but tell your consumers about these risks. Make sure they are educated and asking if and how you and their other jewelers are actually addressing them, and be honest about them. Earlier this year, I had the chance to write a lot about the subject of what I think the word responsible means in this context, and the core of what it means to me is honesty. Warts and all reporting and communication, even when you're still not exactly sure of everything that is happening. Companies are very good at announcing when they are starting a project and good at reporting on when it's finished. But they're not so good usually at reporting on what's happening along the way. And that is the essence of due diligence. That is the essence of risk. That is the essence of when you have questions that you need to answer for yourselves and that your customers need to know how you're doing it. Okay. Back to Chicago rap for me to close. If you have heard me speak on these topics before, you know I often quote one of Chicago's finest ever MCs, Chance the Rapper, who rapped on one of his early mixtapes, quote, "Sometimes the truth don't rhyme." I have used that quote in many contexts, including at my older son's bar mitzvah, but this is the one where it matters the most. These issues are hard, and they deal with terrible violence, conflict, corruption, environmental, and human rights abuse. In the context of jewelry and the products you put so much time and effort into developing,
the last thing you may want to talk about are these difficult and depressing issues. But they are the truth. And even if they don't rhyme, even if they don't sound perfect at first when you talk about them with your customers, the work you all do in taking these raw materials and creating beauty in a way that benefits the communities, the people, the land you work with, that does rhyme, and you should all continue to sing about it. Thank you very much.
You're going to stick around and take some questions, right, Brad?
I mean, I don't have anywhere else to be, so yeah.
Okay, I'm going to pose the first question from our virtual audience. And please just raise your hands when you have a question. Kristen's going to run the mic out so that your neighbors can hear your question and so that the virtual audience can hear your question as well. But the first question is from Christina Male. And she says, or she asks, Brad, if you could give us a wish list of how we can keep these sanctioned metals and minerals out of the supply chain. For example, are these issues on the agenda for Davos? Or, how can we get these topics out of compliance and into leadership?
That's a great question. That sounds like what I'm supposed to be doing at my job every day. Look, the answer, sure, it would be great if world leaders were more focused on these issues at Davos and in other forums like it. But I guess I would say I don't think the world lacks for proclamations and declarations and reports and international institutions saying this is really important, and international conferences. The Kimberley process was a UN created with lots of international attention at very, very high levels. I'm not going to talk about the Kimberley process, but I don't know that it's a lack of awareness or attention. I think it's exactly what I said in my remarks. My wish list is that companies ask hard questions and make meaningful change. And I think you all, this audience tends to be the companies that do it. But other parts of the industry, I think, need to expand and enhance the meaningfulness of their due diligence and start to make change and start to, as I said at the end, be honest about about what you all are facing. I think we're in a cycle of, an NGO or a media report will come out and say all these terrible things are happening, and usually the response from industry and government is, yeah, we know, or we're trying, and then the conversation stops. And I think for me, my wish list would be that conversation is actually maintained in the open about how we're trying to make change. Where are the bad actors? In addition to, the sanctions list is only going to ever contain so many people, but who else are the bad actors? And how do we do due diligence that gets them out of the industry? I think that's to me, that's my main wish list, is how do we have due diligence that really drives out the bad actors? And that is not necessarily through international proclamations and declarations, but rather through meaningful due diligence and open and honest reporting.
Good morning. My question is about sanctions against El Rosa and Russian origin rough.
Mm-hmm.
It's my understanding that a lot of that rough it's okay if it's cut somewhere like in India and sent on. Am I wrong on that?
I guess it depends on what your definition of okay is.
I'm not.
That's fair.
Saying legally. I'm not talking in terms of sanctions.
So in terms of So in terms of sanctions, the way the rules work are, the import ban only applies to Russian origin, and that excludes anything that is substantially transformed in another country, and moving from rough to polished is considered a substantial transformation. So when diamonds are imported, principally from India, they are considered to be essentially a product of India at that point and not a product of Russia. And as has been publicly reported, the Indian government has permitted diamond companies there to buy rough in rupees. The benefit of that being that the U.S. sanctions also essentially apply to the main way they are often felt is through when transactions happen in U.S. dollars. even if, if an Indian company is buying from Alrosa and they're buying it in US dollars, the way the banking system works, for a millisecond, that transaction is going to hit a bank in probably New York. But if they just buy in rupees, then they avoid that New York process and they avoid that sanctions risk. So in general, yes, you're right. The sanctions as implemented at the moment still permit companies to be importing. The question is, there are two questions with that sort of get down on a company by company basis. One, as I mentioned, that's the designation applies to anything in which Alrosa has an interest. And so if you have a sort of third party sale where Alrosa sells to a company and that company pays full price and that's that, then in general that should not create an ongoing interest. But if there are situations as not atypical in the industry to have the seller have an ongoing interest or right in those goods, either on consignment or future royalties, et cetera, there could be issues there. I'm not saying that happens. I'm just saying that's not uncommon in the industry. And then the second part is, where sanctions ends and where and where broader due diligence begins. Broader OECD, conflict affected and responsible minerals guidance, anti-money laundering, other kinds of due diligence, does come into the picture of whether or not a company wants to continue sourcing diamonds from Alrosa. But the sanctions, as you say, at the moment have those limitations in terms of their impact. And then it's the broader question of where due diligence takes over.
Hi, Brad.
Hi.
Thank you for your presentation, as always. This is Christina Villegas with PACT. I have a question on the India loophole, as my colleague just requested. I was wondering, I guess, how close are we to closing that loophole with regard to Russian diamonds? And I guess what I'm really getting at is, what is the appetite within state or the Biden administration to make labeling of proper origin of diamonds required on import? So not just slapping a label saying, cut in India, but actually saying where it's actually mined. What is the actual appetite of the current administration?
I think, now that I'm back in government, I think I can say is, we convened the industry a couple of weeks ago to larger companies in the industry to ask, to inquire about the impact of Russia sanctions so far, to learn more. I think it's a subject under discussion and consideration. I don't know that I can give you a direct answer on sort of what the appetite is or what would be needed to change. I'll note that I think the House version of the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, which is one of the bills that passes every year in Congress, has a provision that talks about the State Department doing a report on things like traceability and what would be needed. That hasn't passed, but I would note that provision is there for those who are interested in learning more about the role that might be played there. But I mean, otherwise, I can just say it's something that we're paying attention to. But I don't think I can give a more direct answer than that. I guess I will say on that, though, it's always helpful to hear more from different perspectives about how the impact of our sanctions are playing out and what their impact and effect really is, and what their effect, in this case, ultimately the goal of all of these sanctions actions has been to try to disrupt and pressure the ability of Russia to carry out this war. And so more information and more assessment of whether individual sanctions actions are contributing to that is helpful. So maybe that's a note that the more the U.S. government hears about that, the more it will remain under consideration.
Sort of corollary to that is So the State Department we have sanctions. India obviously does not. So what is the level of U.S. involvement trying to get the rest of the world involved in the same set of sanctions?
Yeah.
Because that's what's going to answer that question ultimately.
Yeah, I mean,
Like the EU.
There's been consistent engagement by senior people at the U.S. Treasury Department, at the State Department, et cetera, with a range of other actors like India around our sanctions and what they mean and how they're implemented. So again, like I can't say much more than there has been a lot of active engagement on that at very senior levels of the U.S. government. So it's something that obviously we're aware of. The international political and diplomatic picture around those issues is obviously pretty complicated. It's not necessarily a straight line between advocacy and engagement and next steps, but it's something that's certainly a priority for a range of different parts of the U.S. government and at pretty senior levels. Obviously, they're engaging not nearly just on diamonds, but the wide array of sanctions issues that relate to Russia. It's definitely on the radar for sure.
Thanks. I just have a similar question. And I just want to mention that I think that starting off the conference with talking about obeying the laws is a good way to lead into responsible jewelry. So that's kind of my thought behind that one, Brad. And similarly, I mean, we didn't only these, like the sanctions against Russia, I think could have been easier, and maybe this would be a better transition if we were already obeying the sanctions against Zimbabwe. But this is a similar thing because the UK is one of the biggest importers of Zimbabwe diamonds. They don't have sanctions and we do. So I guess that's the thing we're kind of all asking how to navigate. In the US, for us to obey our laws is sometimes different than all of the people that we work with internationally. So how do we navigate that with, being US citizens, obeying the laws and all of our own sanctions, working in an international environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky for sure. I mean, it's always, you'll hear any official who talks about sanctions say sanctions are always better when they are multilateralized and consistent across different jurisdictions. That's why the range of sanctions against Russia was so important early on, because there was such a consistent level of it. I mean, other than acknowledging that it's challenging, I think I can say, as U.S., for those who are U.S. citizens, U.S. persons, even when you're doing business in places where transactions may be allowed, you are always a U.S. person and subject to our sanctions rules. And, I think it's hard to say much more than that, other than the more due diligence you are doing and the more you're working with your partners in other places where, even if, as I said, sanctions are the beginning of answers to due diligence, right? And so even if not every jurisdiction imposes sanctions in the way that the U.S. does, the underlying reasons for those sanctions are a part of international standards and guidance, whether it's anti-money laundering, whether it's the OECD due diligence. Obviously the UK is not in the EU, but the EU is, working on its human rights due diligence and its minerals regulations. So even if that's not sanctions, they do have other systems and regimes that require these kinds of questions to be answered or to be asked and then answered. And I think it's also a lot about what I said, which is even if those sanctions aren't consistent today, it doesn't mean that they can't be, right? And that's where industry engagement, talking about what's happening, talking about these challenges, having your partners in other countries who are facing these challenges and facing these conflicting regimes, talking with their governments about the challenges is also helpful, right? The fact that the sanctions regimes are not matched today doesn't mean that they can't be matched next week if there's a level of engagement and advocacy and awareness raising consistently by the industry about where these gaps are and where the mismatches are that allow allow goods that U.S. persons are not allowed to deal with to be dealt with, by our partners. That's something often that government officials aren't super aware of. And so I would encourage all of you to engage with the U.S. government, to engage with foreign governments, to find the right people just to put this on their radar, because obviously people in our offices are dealing with a lot of issues across many, many sectors that are very fast moving, and it can be hard to track how these things are working and where those things are, and you all live them every day. I guess don't assume too much about what, I happen to have worked in this industry for a long time in different ways, but there aren't too many, more typically at state and at foreign ministries around the world, you have people that work on issues for 2 or 3 years and then rotate off and go to other places. That's how the system works for very many good reasons. But it can be hard to have people who track these issues over a long term, and because they are issues that play out and your work is over the long term, it can be hard to find that consistency. It can be frustrating. You have to have the same meetings and raise the same points over and over again, but I would encourage you to keep doing that.
I have a follow-up question, and then I have a different question. Brad, it sounds like you're inviting some input by different members of the jewelry sector to the U.S. government. I was wondering if you can talk about what agencies, either within state or others, that would receive input from small or large businesses that want to know where the diamonds come from, but are currently being stopped because of mislabeling, in my opinion. Compliant labeling officially, but the consumer deserves to know, and so do the makers. And so I was wondering if you can kind of maybe guide us on if an association of businesses, for example, were to do a campaign, who should they meet with, like which agencies are lead ones, to really make sure that American business has a choice of partners, a clear choice, and the consumer knows where their stuff comes from. And then my second question is, there's a lot of leadership bodies, like you said, and I know that you were part of one of those, RJC, earlier this year. I was wondering if you can kind of talk about what RJC and then maybe the Jewelry and Watch Initiative should keep doing and what they should stop doing to really help advocate for help be true reformers in the sector, especially with regard to diamonds. I know you left RJC for various reasons. Have you seen changes? What could they do better? And what's your advice, again, to stop and to start doing? Thanks.
Well, look at the time. I guess I got to go. All right. We should just have coffee and talk about this at home. On the first, in terms of who to engage with in the U.S. government, I think, I'm here and I work in the Office of the Sanctions Coordinator. I think state is a good address in general, both because of our, I think, orientation towards engagement, through the Economic Bureau, Economic and Business Affairs Bureau, embassies, we're the agency that has embassies, that has people on the ground just about everywhere, and has the ability to have that local knowledge in a way that no other agency really does. And is the lead representative at most every international institution. So I think there are plenty of other agencies in the U.S. government that have a role in those issues, from the Treasury Department, which obviously implements most of our sanctions programs, the Labor Department and the International Labor Affairs Bureau and its role in identifying products made with forced and child labor that prevent imports, customs, which is now having a big role in the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act and other import declarations, commerce, talk about labeling, that's the Federal Trade Commission. Like there's a wide array of agencies, but I think hopefully I won't get too much trouble by saying when I get back by saying that I think state is a good starting point and a good convener in the U.S. interagency, and I would other than you and I who live in D.C. and don't have representation, I would encourage folks to go to their members of Congress and staff. There, especially if if your members of Congress are on relevant foreign affairs and foreign relations committees, or banking or any of the committees that are relevant to these issues, engage on them. And yeah, Christina and I will live as part of the world of taxation without representation. Maybe I can make a speech about DC statehood next year. And then, on RJC and the Watch and Jewelry Initiative, look, I guess all I would say is I would just go back to what I said in my speech. I think any organization is only going to be as effective as its members are in meaningful implementation of standards and honest reporting. The issues that I had before, and to be honest, I haven't paid super close attention to what's been happening at various initiatives since I got back to state, because it's busy. But I think to me and was sort of my answer to the first question. At the moment, I'm less. I'm somebody who I think personally, and this is not the official view of the State Department. My own view is initiatives and organizations and big institutions can be useful in setting direction and can be useful in steering, in pointing where things should go, in pointing out issues, but they tend to be, they can be slow to react. They can be beset by consensus and, the need to keep the whole together. Understandably, I think the real work and the real change and the real way that traceability and other initiatives come to be is when companies make it their business to do it. And, at the moment, that is, I think, to a large extent, smaller companies in the industry, but not only. And, there are more companies that maybe 20 years ago said it could never be done, you can't do, and now are experimenting. And I think the work of small companies, the work of companies that take issues like traceability and due diligence seriously, I don't know if you want to call it like a bottom-up way or what the right framework is for it, but I think that's really where the change is, because that's where it's specific and meaningful and not auditable in some kind of audit framework, et cetera, but actually reviewable on the ground and willing to acknowledge that there isn't perfection. Like, I think the issue with any of these things is we sometimes look and hope that systems, organizations, et cetera, will get us to some kind of thing where things are fixed. And I think all of you know way better than I do, like, anytime you think you have an issue solved, like, you just sort of wait a couple days and like that issue will come back in some kind of different way. And when you thought you solved something, you've actually created 3 other problems. And so, I think that's the work, right? And the work is ensuring that you keep up with that no matter how hard it is. And I think there is an illusion in a lot of places and through a lot of these big initiatives and organizations that, like, okay, we got it, we're taking care of the issue. And I think, if anything, for me, it's a matter of the opposite is true. It's got to be a matter of these issues are hard and they change. And when we sanction a company, they often change their name, and then the issue still exists. You just have to keep up with your due diligence and ensuring that you're checking, and you say, oh, this company was called, yesterday it was called, Green Diamonds Inc. Today it's called Greenish Diamonds Inc. I wonder if it's the same company. Like that's what due diligence is. But, you'd be surprised at how often it's like, well, Greenish Diamonds isn't on the list. I guess it's fine. And so I think that's the kind of thing that we need to work through. So that's a admittedly meandering and elusive answer, but that's the best I can do.
And you just segued right into my question.
All right. Please make it easier than those last two.
I'll try, but it's not going to be, you know it.
Yeah, maybe I came to the wrong place. Anyway,
so my brain always goes to what's the solution, what's the solution, what's the solution. I don't think any of us are going to untangle the geopolitical, mess that we're in. But my question is, like, my brain goes to traceability, like that's the solution, So industries like the airline industry, they trace every single nut and bolt in the whole supply chain of building an airplane. And I guess my question is, I know you're in the tangle of the red tape and being in government. Does your brain go to a place of solution? Like, is there a place that's you can cut through? Like, is it our industry that's going to have to regulate and trace our materials? Like, I know for the bigger part of our industry, we don't have the appetite for that. In this room, that's very different. Mm-hmm. But there's got to be an easier way than dodging all of these, sanctions and loopholes with India. Just as a small business for me, it's like, I just want to know that my diamonds aren't causing slavery and killing people and are cut in a place that, families can thrive and all of those things. And, listening to you talk is wonderful, and I'm glad there's people out there, but it's so opaque. It's not clear.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, in your brain, not your, governmental role, but in your brain, is there a clear solution that our industry could possibly take that could cut through a lot of this garbage, if you will?
Yeah, we should also have coffee. Yeah, it's a good question, obviously, and I think, throughout my time in the industry, I've tried to focus on solutions and doing things on the ground in different places. Mike Locke is in the room somewhere. Mike and I, had coffee in the basement of the State Department in late 2010 and thought we should probably try to do something that helps create a mechanism through which conflict-free minerals could make it to the market, and with a number of other people over the course of a year helped create the Public-Private Alliance for Responsible Minerals Trade, which still is up and running. Other things at GIA and other places. That's definitely what I try to be a part of. I think what I've learned, though, is one, you're right that the starting point is traceability. And initiatives that will enable greater traceability. I think the question is, traceability has to come with those questions of due diligence, right? Just because something came from somewhere doesn't mean that it isn't also contributing to bad harm along the way, right? Like there's that the information is the starting point. Where did it come from? You mentioned the airline sector. I'm actually not familiar that much with the airline sector, but if you think about coffee or food or other kinds of products where you can see the place where it came from. It isn't that the knowledge of those places has then ended the problems in those communities or ended the situations, right? It has to then come with engagement. So I think, to me, it's a balance of traceability, so that there is clear and consistent and transparent information, but then matched with engagement. And whether that's, any of the initiatives and products and companies like are in this room that have developed over the years to do just that, from Moyo and on, I think that's where it comes from. And I think getting bigger companies to do that work alongside, I think is, it's not quick, and it doesn't, and I don't know that it's going to be a regulatory solution. I don't know that there's a role. Maybe there is. I'm certainly not in the position of saying I think that's the answer. I don't know that there's a regulatory solution that says this is required, because even when you have those, it doesn't necessarily bring about the change. It gets back to that honesty in communication, and matched with being open about the work that you all are doing and the work with your consumers, and over time the industry will get there. But it's the solutions are more and more programs like that. It's traceability matched with the engagement and the development programs that do the work and that show it's possible, right? I think when I started working on these issues at State in 2009, there weren't that many examples of, there was the idea that this will all be better if companies are willing to do well by doing good, as a former boss of mine used to say. But there weren't a ton of examples of it. And now there are more. There are more examples that show this is possible. It's hard, it's costly, it's frustrating, etc. But it's doable, and here's why it needs to be doable at a greater scale. And so the solutions I go to aren't necessarily this is the solution, but rather we need lots of solutions that all look a bit different. And I know enough to know, learn enough to know that the solution for the community in Tanzania, in one community in Tanzania, is going to be probably different than the solution for the next community over, let alone in Eastern Congo, let alone in Zimbabwe, let alone in the Amazon. All of those solutions look very different. And so it has to be, we need to know where it comes from, its traceability, and we're going to be involved over the long term with doing that. And I think the industry traditionally wasn't set up to allow that, right? The structure of the diamond industry especially was not established and is not structured. The site holder system is not set up to allow any of that stuff to happen. But it doesn't mean it can't be. It's a matter of long-term engagement. So maybe that's also an evasive answer, but it's, I don't know. I wish I had the, this is what it needs to be. I think about it all the time. And I've ended up at the honest communication, traceability, engagement. Some mix of that is where the change comes from. And it's, it's going to be very long in coming.
Well, I like what you said about, a bottom-up approach. And I wonder if that could happen quicker if maybe the U.S. government gives incentives to small businesses like Moyo, like people who are doing the right thing, to help fuel that and have it happen faster.
I think advocacy along those lines sounds like a good idea. I mean,
Guys,
I
we don't
can't,
have time. We have time for what?
I can't say. I think we have to get creative about where the solutions come from, and whether that's, again, some of that may be in Congress, some of that may be through USAID, through other development agencies, and through the private sector, dedicating funds and staff and time to these issues. I will say the last thing I'll say on all of this is the time piece, right? All of you understand how long this stuff takes, how many challenges there are, and our world doesn't work so well on this is going to take 10 years and it's going to be really hard, and we don't know where the solution, and then we don't know what's going to happen at the end. That's not the world it's certainly not the world that Washington is these days. So I think that's also the reason why all the communication and the honesty and the transparency is important, because it conveys to people that, this isn't, we can't solve this problem in a 12-month funding cycle. That may be how a bank or a government or some other thing works. Like, we need to change that framework, and I don't know how that's done, but I think advocacy around programs and support and other ways that companies that are doing the work can benefit from it. I mean, that sounds like a good approach to me. So, yeah.
I know you're out of time, Brad, so I'll take a 1-hour question and take a yes, no, or maybe answer.
All right.
In the movement towards sanctions and with COP27 starting next week and the focus on business and climate and business stepping up, do you see the potential for climate-based sanctions regionally in the future?
You said I could just use one word?
Yes, no, or maybe.
Yes, no, or maybe. All right, I'll go with maybe. I mean, I don't know.
Maybe it's not acceptable.
All right. You just gave it to me and took it away. I guess that's like the government. We give it to you, then we take it away. I don't know. I mean, certainly when I was at the Century, the advocacy organization I was at before, I had conversations with different organizations that were advocating for things like that. I couldn't say how likely or unlikely it is. I don't think it's not worth advocating for. I think it's an interesting idea. I think you can read many, many articles about the question of, are we overusing sanctions? Are we using sanctions properly? What's the right role of sanctions? That's another speech for another time. And so I think the question would just be, my boss, Ambassador Bryan, spends a lot of time saying, really working with everybody in the U.S. government to ensure that when we're using sanctions, they are part of an overarching policy, like we're pointing somewhere. We know what the objective is, and then we have a set of strategies we're using to get there, and sanctions is just one piece of those. Obviously, climate is an issue where we have a very overarching objective, and we have a lot of things we're doing on it. Whether sanctions should be a part of that strategy, I think it's an interesting point to advocate for.
One of their statements was tying environmental issues to economic issues. So that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and it's not one that I know that much about. But again, like all of these questions, I think it's worth engaging two of the three branches of government about.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you, Brad.